And that is where he went into the research. And if you think of the world of academia, there are very few Jains involved, or there is very little work done in the in Jain philosophy. And it is so fortunate that there are a few more people going into that. One of our eminent personalities in that field was Dr. Sulek Jain, who has, of course, made it possible for him to come here at Jain Society today. So we are very glad to have you here, Dr. Mundra. Welcome, and thank you very much for stopping by here on your way back. Just a little bit about Dr. Mundra, that he is the first Alka Siddharth Dalal postdoctoral fellow for the study of Jainism in the Department of Religion at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, and has been, to take off my glasses, that's one of the things, right? I was just struggling, I'm sorry. New Brunswick, and has been given the honor of delivering inaugural Bhagwaan Mahavir lecture in Jain studies at Rice University, which is where he was yesterday evening. Today, he will explain how his multi-religious Indian American upbringing led him to the academic study of religion and research on the philosophical works of the great Acharya Haribhadra Suri, and what they can teach us about dealing with the differences and polarization that we see in the contemporary world. He completed his dissertation on the philosophy of Acharya Haribhadra Suri last summer, and is now working on turning it into a book. Dr. Mundra received his bachelor's degree in mathematics and the history and philosophy of science, and MA and PhD in religious studies at the University of Chicago. Before graduate school, he worked in international development, journalism, and financial services. He has taught at Brandeis University, the College of the Holy Cross, Loyola, Marymount University, and the University of Wisconsin. He has published articles on Jain philosophy in various journals and edited books. And it is, again, one more time, I'll say it's a great honor that he's here today. I wish there were far more people sitting here to listen to him, but this is the new reality that we are facing, is in the times of YouTube and Zoom. Not many people prefer to travel, but well, we will certainly at the future point in a few days' time, we will post this. We decided not to Zoom it today, or we won't have even these many people. So in a few days, we will post it on YouTube. And in the interim now, we should go ahead and listen to Dr. Mundra make his presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Mundra. Namaste. And I'll be, just give me 1 minute like this.
Okay, sure. Well, thank you very, very much, Nitinji. And thank you all so much for bringing me here. I mean, I think this this new virtual age has opened up a lot of opportunities, of course, for us to hear things and be exposed to things that to increase our information overload even more. But it's I'm not going to speak directly into the mic. I'm just going to project. It's not audible. Oh, okay. All right. Well, then I'll just hold it. Take it down. So, but there, of course, is something special about being in person. So I appreciate being here in person with you all, and I appreciate you being here in person with me. You all can hear me, right? And I think it's coming through the speakers, and they can hear me. Kalpesh ji, right? Huh? Oh, it was low. Okay. So so yeah. Ooh, too loud. That's too loud. That's good. All right, if you say so. Okay. We're about to get some feedback. I'm getting some feedback. Turn it down a little bit. Turn it down a little bit, please. I'm begging you. Okay. All right. So should I start? Should Nitinji?
Yes, sir.
So you and I were talking in the car, Nitinji, about how you know, doing rituals, singing, you know, pronouncing the mantras, reciting the mantras, and the hymns and everything without really understanding them. And you know, we all have this experience. I think I certainly did growing up. You know, I would do all these things, say all these things in these languages that I didn't understand and had really no idea what I was doing or saying. And you know, I think one part of growing up in American culture, for many reasons, and for better or worse, you know, growing up sort of, especially as a second generation person, as a child of immigrants, one thing is not really liking to do things just because you're told to do them, right? Without understanding why you're doing them. And then at the same time, those of us, you know, children of immigrants we're removed from our heritage, you know, in this physical, geographical sense. And so we need to try a little harder to understand it. It's not always automatic to understand our heritage. So I grew up asking a lot of religious and philosophical questions, and I would get a lot of you know, answers. I would get some very deep answers from my father, especially, who you know, he would try to answer my questions the best he could, and that discussion helped form me into the person that I am today and the scholar that I am. So I ended up going to the University of Chicago for college, as Nitinji mentioned. I studied math and physics, and I also studied philosophy. And then, but then I started asking the questions about, you know, about that too, even about the, you know, the science and mathematics, about what it all, you know, what it all means. Does science really have all the answers? And at the same time, I was feeling the need to sort of understand myself better, right? Understand better where I came from. And so in college, I started studying Hindi, and I started going to India more frequently than I had as a kid. And so then when I graduated from college, I went to India and for a year to start studying Sanskrit. And so then I started to understand these, you know, the prayers and the shlokas and mantras and all this that I had grown up reciting, these words that I had always heard, and, you know, without understanding them, right? And so this was an important step toward my career today. It wasn't a direct line. I started working in doing other jobs first in international development and then in journalism. And along the way, I kept trying to read Sanskrit in my spare time and, you know, read philosophy, but I could never sort of devote as much time to go as deeply as I wanted. And, you know, I was working in journalism, and I have to say the sort of the daily and weekly news felt quite superficial to me compared to, you know, the deep history of tradition that we're drawing in religions, right? And so finally I decided to go back to graduate school so that I could devote myself full time to reading Sanskrit and Prakrit and philosophy. And I ended up going back to the University of Chicago, this time to the Divinity School, which turns out to be one of the best places in America to study Indian philosophy and religions. I hadn't saved up a ton of money, but the good thing about grad school in the humanities and you know, going to grad school in the humanities in this country, in the US, is that the top PhD programs pay you to do their degrees. So, you know, because this is a large time commitment. I won't tell you how long I took to do my PhD, but, you know, and then of course the financial payoff afterwards is not huge. It's not like, you know, having some other kinds of doctorates or going straight into, you know, finance or something. So they will fund you in the university, and you know, it's not a ton. You won't get rich doing it, but it's enough to live, and it's enough to live well. So, and then afterwards, hopefully you get a job as a professor, which again is not as lucrative as being a doctor or a lawyer or a banker, but it's enough to live comfortably. And and so now I have a temporary professorship, a postdoc, and we'll hopefully be getting a permanent one before too long. Anyway, this whole situation, this is a very different situation than the current situation that you have in India in the humanities, right? Humanities scholarship is for the most part really not valued there in sort of in academia in India, in the secular sort of spaces. And it's really not considered a viable career path. It's something that you can actually just get a job doing. So people always ask me, what are you doing and what's your job? And there's a large amount of incomprehension sort of in India about this whole thing, right? So I view it as kind of oh, and I was going to say you have this weird situation because in India this is not really supported financially. You have this weird situation where you have Indians coming to the US to study Sanskrit and other aspects of Indian languages and culture and so on. So, I mean, that to me is kind of a crazy upside down kind of situation that people are leaving India to study Indian traditions. And I understand, to some degree why this is happening. I mean, it's, I understand that, technical education will have to be prioritized in India for, until, some basic sort of things are in place and India develops more and raises the standard of living and so on. But anyway, in this country, we have a high standard of living, we have a large GDP, and we have the luxury of being able to cultivate these goods, you could say goods of the spirit and mind, and not just, goods of the body and financial goods. So the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, not because it has some sort of instrumental payoff, right? So and I think that since this kind of scholarship is largely being neglected back in India, I personally feel a responsibility to contribute to preserving the cultural riches of knowledge that have been in India and have been kept in India and have been kept very largely, as Nitinji and I were just discussing, kept very largely by the Jain community for thousands of years. My mission is not just cultural preservation, but making this intelligible, right? Making these treasures, riches of knowledge intelligible, making it usable knowledge, understandable knowledge to contemporary culture and the world. And so, so that this shouldn't just seem like some outdated artifact or just some, obscure religious thing, but something living, something that we can all still learn from. All of us, irrespective of religious affiliation. And that also that people who haven't been exposed to it yet can learn from it too. So, so as you can tell from my last name, Mundra there, some of you will know that my father's family is Marwari. So, but they've been in Maharashtra for centuries. And they've been mostly in the western part of the state. But my grandfather moved to Wardha in the east. My grandfather moved to the city of Wardha in the eastern part of Maharashtra. Does anyone know of Wardha? I mean, it's a known city. It's a big railway hub. Does anyone know who the most famous resident of Wardha was in the 1930s? Anyone know? Gandhiji. So my grandfather worked to Wardha in order to work for Mahatma Gandhiji. Gandhiji had moved to Wardha because it was right in the center of India. So he wanted to conduct his independence campaign, partly because it was sort of equidistant from all parts of India and at this major rail hub where you can hop on the train and ride in a third-class cabin, as Gandhiji used to do, to any part of India. And so my grandfather moved there to help him in that work. And he was actually his financial secretary for a short period of time. So I don't have a photo of my grandparents with Gandhiji, but this is a picture of them with, some of you certainly know who that is. Nehru, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. And then you see my grandfather and my grandmother there. So that's the closest I could get to have. I also have a picture of him with my grandparents with Moraji Desai, but I thought this was a slightly more recognizable figure, even from the back. So my grandfather ended up, as I say, he worked for Gandhiji for a short period. Then he ended up working as the long-term personal secretary of Vinobaji Bhave. As people have heard of Vinobaji. So one of Vinobaji's claims to fame was that he was the first person chosen by Gandhiji to offer individual satyagraha as a conscientious objection to India's participation in World War II. And so, and actually my grandmother, you see there on the left, Mira Mundra, she was actually the first woman chosen by Gandhiji to offer this conscientious pacifism, objection to the war, or to fighting in the war. Of course, this is a very complicated issue, by the way. I'm not going to get into this, but India's participation in World War II, fight against fascism, but India as a colony, very complicated issue. We won't get into the politics of it, but this was, there was there was an issue of conscientious objection to the violence of the war. And so my grandmother was actually chosen by Gandhiji as the first woman to offer individual satyagraha. This is the first time that satyagraha, civil disobedience, was made a sort of individual thing where Gandhiji was saying that individuals could do it rather than having these mass mobilizations and marches and sit-ins and things. So my grandmother was asked to do it. She ended up not doing it because she was actually pregnant at the time with one of my aunties. And of course, what would happen, these civil disobedience usually resulted in, getting beaten, getting imprisoned. And so, her pregnancy was too risky so she couldn't risk doing all that. So someone else did it. Okay, so that's a small digression, but Gandhiji was of course deeply influenced by Jainism in many ways. Certainly in his ahimsa and the kind of thing that informed something, like this, the conscientious objection to the violence of war. Also in his, his understanding and use of tapas, spiritual ascetic practice. And also, as probably some of you know, Gandhiji called himself an anekantavadi, which he said, so, and for those of you who don't know, anekantavada is, there's many ways to translate it, but I would translate it as the Jain doctrine of multiplicity or non-one-sidedness. That's sort of a literal translation. And Gandhiji said that his anekantavada, his doctrine of non-one-sidedness, is the result of the twin doctrines of Satya and Ahimsa. So it came from his understanding of course, Ahimsa, nonviolence, and also his understanding of Satya. Satya meaning, of course, truth, another central Jain principle and value. And Satya was, you may know, was sort of the most important thing for Gandhiji. He always positioned Satya at the center of his thought. And he said, in fact, that truth, Satya, is God, or actually he liked to flip it and say that God is truth, Satya. And he thought, in fact, that there was some truth, some Satya in all religions. And he had people in his ashram there in Wardha and in Gujarat and Sabarmati before he moved to Wardha. He had them, daily reciting prayers from a whole range of different religions, prayers from a lot of different religions. They go through and recite them, for one at a time. It takes about 15 minutes usually. I was just there in Sabarmati, and they still do this. COVID, of course, has changed things a little bit. So there was just one person there doing it. I sat there with her and did the daily prarthana in all the singing hymns from all these different religions. So this is the kind of sensibility that I was raised with, very much this sort of interfaith sensibility. We have representatives here from Interfaith Ministry. So this was very much, Gandhi's sensibility about interfaith. And so when I went to graduate school to study the philosophy of religions, I really wanted to try to go deeply into this question of how to think about the diversity of religions and, how to find truth in the face of that diversity. And the philosopher who maybe confronted these questions more seriously and more persistently than anyone else in pre-modern India, I think, was the great Acharya Haribhadra. And so that's who I decided I needed to write my doctoral dissertation on. How many of you have heard of Haribhadra before today? Or before yesterday, if those of you that were that were at my talk yesterday. Okay, good. So how did you, by the way, how have you, I mean, how did you learn about him, if you can remember? Right. So just from hearing stories, and then you heard stories about him, and yeah. Okay. So he is as you say, totally prominent Acharya, one of the very most, I mean, really, he's a transformative figure in Jainism, and one of the most prolific and wide-ranging authors, really, of any Indian tradition at all, any tradition in Indian intellectual history. He is sort of one of the most important and prolific and one of the people with sort of the most capacious mind, you could say. And sorry, I lost my place in my notes here. So he's he wrote a lot of different kinds of things. A ton of different works are attributed to him. So scriptural commentaries, right? Commentaries on agams, Jain agamas, texts on lay conduct, monastic conduct, worship, yoga, as well as a number of very important philosophical essays, which is what my research focuses on and what I am going to be telling you about in some more detail now. So I argue that his philosophical works are sort of a shining exemplar of a number of intellectual qualities that I think we can all learn from. Qualities like following the truth where it leads, being willing to revise your beliefs, scholarly neutrality and objectivity. For those of you that want to follow along, I have these up on the slide here. Respect and understanding across differences. Critical rationality. Finding common ground amidst difference. And using common sense to give a complete description of reality in all its complexity. Now, it might not be clear to you yet what exactly any of this means. So the rest of my talk is going to explain all of this. I'm going to have a sip of water and let you look at that for a second. Okay, so Haribhadra is thought to have lived in the mid to late first millennium around the fort city of Chittor. Anyone know where Chittor is? Has anyone been to Chittor? Rajasthan, right? Southern Rajasthan, near Udaipur. And the story goes that he was originally a Brahmin who was so puffed up with learning, so full of himself, literally, that he wore a golden belt to try to rein in his overflowing knowledge. So you can see in this popular depiction of Haribhadra as in his Brahminical life, you can see faintly, you can see this sort of golden belly plate that is containing his overflowing, overweening knowledge. And he vowed that if anyone could say something that he couldn't understand, he would make himself their disciple. He would submit himself to them and make himself their disciple. And so one day, that's just what happened. He overheard a sadhvi, you can see here, a Jain nun, reciting a prayer that was unintelligible to him. He heard it and he could not make sense of what she was saying, despite his tremendous learning. And so he immediately humbled himself before her, and he was then initiated into Jainism by her Acharya, her teacher, but many of Haribhadra works identify him as her spiritual son. He calls himself, I am Yakini Mahatara Putra, the spiritual son of this sadhvi Yakini Mahatara. And so one characteristic that I think we can already see in the story that's important in Haribhadra philosophy is this idea, the first thing I put in on the last slide, following the truth wherever it leads, even if it means having to change your mind and revise the commitments that you started with, right? So now, if you talk to non-Jains, Haribhadra Suri is most famous as the author of a text called the Shaddarshana Samuchaya. So in English, I would say the compilation or compendium of 6 views or philosophies or viewpoints, Shaddarshana Samuchaya. So if you know anything about Indian philosophy, you've probably heard that there are 6 darshanas. Have any of you, does it sound familiar to any? Does anyone know what the 6 darshanas are? Can you list a few of them? Go ahead. Huh? That's 2. Yeah, 4. Yeah. Okay, very good, Nitinji. You won the one. So and you said correctly that those are considered the those are the Vedic 6 philosophies. So very often nowadays, there are often said to be 6 philosophical schools of Hinduism. And Jainism is not usually included, is not included in that list, as you just said. But Haribhadra Suri is actually the very first person to talk about 6 philosophies, 6 philosophical schools. He's the first he's the first person to use that phrase, say Shaddarshana, 6 schools, and he does include Jainism, as well as Buddhism, which are not usually included in that list of 6 Hindu schools. So this is one of the first philosophical surveys in India. And it's one of the most systematic. Haribhadra is careful to specify what the features of each what the features of each school are. That is, what principles they believe in and what gods they believe in. That's how he does it. So he's really the first author to sort of approach other schools in this way. And another thing that's really distinctive about his approach is that he's the first one to do this without any refutations or arguments. He just lists what these various schools believe without trying to refute them. So other authors, when you see other of these kinds of surveys in Sanskrit literature, they very often introduce these schools just in order to show why they're wrong. There's these guys, and they're wrong, and this is what's wrong with all of them. There's none of that in the Shaddarshana Samuchaya. Now, Haribhadra does do that in some other places, and we'll get to that. But in the Shaddarshana Samuchaya, there's none of this. There's no particular order or hierarchy of the presentation saying, this school is the best. He's just listing them. And, oh, yes, there they are. Sorry. Yeah, I was going to show you this. So he says there are just these 6 schools according to the basic differences between them, and the differences you know them according to their respective differences between their deities and their principles of reality. As I said, this is his system. This is his system for classifying the 6 schools. And most of the survey is done by quoting the other schools. So he represents them very nearly as they represent themselves. And this is another remarkable feature of his work. So you can see in this comparison of a few of the shlokas where with their possible sources. On the left, you have, Haribhadra, this column. This is Haribhadra's text. These are some excerpts of Haribhadra's text. This is possible sources of some of these lines. These are the possible source text, and this is the name of that possible source text. And as you can see, you don't have to know Sanskrit or anything to be able to see that if you just look at the red orange bits, the bits that are in the colored orange text, those are the ones that exactly correspond between Haribhadra's text and the possible sources of them, the original. So you see that there's a lot that he's really quoting very directly in many cases from these possible source texts. And so a lot of people have noticed that his stance here is sort of unusually neutral. It's sort of a model of scholarly objectivity. Now, of course, he's clear about his allegiances, his Jain allegiances. He doesn't try to hide the fact that he's Jain, and he starts this text with a stavan, a praise of to the Jina Mahavir, Bhagwaan Mahavir, and he says, I'm Jain, my allegiances are to the Jina, but he doesn't denigrate the other schools. He simply reports their doctrines. And so he seems to me to be interested above all in the sheer fact of the sheer fact that there are a range of different possible views that we can talk about coherently, and that we can understand these different schools as sort of having the same conversation, and that Jainism is a legitimate participant in that philosophical conversation. So I think clearly in our contemporary 21st century cacophony of public discourse, which, so fractured by social media and ideological and political differences, I think this ability to sort of just have a common conversation and understanding across difference is something that is just very badly needed. Now, as I said, although this survey doesn't debate the other schools, that's not because Haribhadra is not interested in debate. In fact, he wrote a whole commentary on the most important system of debate in medieval India, which was devised by a Buddhist philosopher named Dignaga. And one thing that's interesting in this commentary, so he's commenting on this Buddhist text, right? But it's interesting how he describes the system of debate, but then again doesn't engage in debate, even though this is originally a Buddhist system that he's commenting on, and he can't agree with all the Buddhist doctrines that appear in it. There's things like, well, okay, I'm actually going to wait to tell you this bit of detail. So, but anyway, in this commentary, he is just like in this survey of the six darshanas, he's just describing and systematizing this system of logic. Okay, his tone is very, it's similar in some ways to when he writes commentaries on Jain texts. He sort of seems to be taking this approach of more of like a student or a disciple than an opponent of Buddhism, right? And this attitude is representative of the respect for Buddhism that you can find in a lot of Haribhadra Suri's writings, and that, again, I think we would all do well to follow when we encounter people from whom we disagree. Think about learning from them, what we can learn from them, and trying to understand them before trying to, show why they're wrong. So Haribhadra says that this commentary is meant for, okay. It's called the Nyaya Pravesha is the text that he's commenting on, Introduction to Logic. And he says that this commentary is meant for judicious people. So the Sanskrit word that I'm translating as judicious people is this one at the top here, Prekshavant, also Preksha Purvakarin or Prashnikas. These are all words that he uses that I think we can translate as judicious people or inquirers. And what that means is that these people are, this is not what I have written here, but I'm just explaining that this idea of judicious people, Prekshavant, is people who are basically non-dogmatic in the sense that they will accept any position as long as it's established rationally, logically, even if that position does not accord with the dogmas of their own tradition. Okay, so that is, they should not have pakshapat. Pakshapat, that's a term that I see some of you nodding your head. You've heard the term before, and I'll come back to that term, pakshapat. Dogmatism or partiality for certain positions without investigating them rationally. So anyway, this is the way he describes prekshavants. That's not what I've said, but this is another way to characterize them. Now, Haribhadra applies this issue of critical rationality to the issue of religion in his most famous essay, I think, which is called the Lokatattva Nirnaya. Lokatattva Nirnaya. And he says there, I'm sure some of you have heard this. I think this is one of the most famous quotes from Sanskrit Jain literature. Pakshapato name vire na dvesha kapiladishu yuktimad vachanam yasya tasya karya parigraha. Does that sound familiar? Has anyone heard that? I mean, it's not like every day, it's not an everyday thing, but it's there. You see it quoted. So I would translate this in English. I have no partiality for Mahavir, nor do I hate others like Kapila. This is a guru of Sankhya, Hindu Sankhya yoga system. He whose words are rational is the one who should be accepted. And then he goes on and he says, salutation be to him who is devoid of all blemishes and full of all virtues, whether Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, or Ajina. yasya nikilascha dosha nasanti sarve gunascha vidyante brahma va vishnurva maheshwaro va namastasmai. So the main thesis of this essay is to show how the jinna is in fact the one who is devoid of all blemishes. You know, it says here, salutation to him who's devoid of who's devoid of all blemishes and full of all virtues. And the point of this essay is to show that that one is the jinna, and that the other gods, you know, that's unlike these other gods who are, you know, said, we hear all these stories about them going around and getting passionate and angry and helping some people and hurting others. And, you know, so that is the jinnas. Haribhadra's claim is that the jinnas deserve our allegiance, and that you can know that rationally by looking at their qualities, that it's not something that you have to just accept on faith without critical investigation, just by pakshapat. So Jyoti Prasad Jain, an author who's written on this, has called this the clarion call of Jain philosophy, and I think I think that's quite right. I think this is a really important line. So now, okay, so now I'm going to come back to the Nyaya Pravesha, to this Haribhadra's commentary on this, the logic of debate, and see what this has to do with what this thing about pakshapata, about you know, not having partiality has to do with with debate. So he says here that these judicious people who engage in debate are intent on the ways of argument, forbearing, that is, so you could say, forgiving, patient, grounded in both sides of a debate, born in good families, they have to be raised right, and they know their own traditions and other people's traditions. Again, I mean, I think this is a very good description of Haribhadra Suri himself, and these are ideals towards we should all strive in a world of deep diversity and polarization. So now, one important issue in this logical system that Haribhadra Suri is talking about and explaining is the question of how much common ground is required between two parties to a debate. So the Sanskrit word for this, for what is accepted in common, so you could say common ground, what is well known, you know, between some people, is the word prasiddha in Sanskrit. Prasiddha, accepted in common, established without controversy between a proponent and an opponent. That's Haribhadra's definition of this word, prasiddha. So in a debate, as we'll see in a second, you need some common ground. Now, you can't require two debaters to agree on everything, right? Because otherwise there would be no debate. If two people agreed about everything, there would just be no debate. And so one of the basic rules in this system is that one should not already agree in particular about the issue, about the question that is at issue in the debate, right? Otherwise, there would be no point in having the debate in the first place. But at the same time, the debaters need to agree on some basic terms in order for the debate to get off the ground. Why is that? Well, I'll show this schematically. In a debate, you have a proposition, right? There's a proposition on the table. You know, chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla ice cream, or, you know, let's say chocolate ice cream is the best. Let's say that's your proposition on the table. That's you have someone who wants to prove this proposition that something is some way, right? Chocolate is best. So logically, logicians would say this is, you have a subject, S is some predicate, P. Chocolate subject is predicate, P, best. But if the other person, if the person who you're debating with, right, if you're putting this motion on the table, you're making this proposition, and the other person doesn't even agree that that thing, the subject, the chocolate ice cream, let's say, exists at all, strike out the subject, then you have nothing to talk about. There's no there. There's no subject for the debate. There's nothing to debate. So take an example, okay, a real example, not about ice cream. But if let's say a Hindu philosopher wants to prove to a Buddhist that the self is conscious. The Hindu philosopher says the self is conscious to a Buddhist. this would be a problem in this system, according to the rules of this debate. Why is that? Does anyone know why this would be a problem? Not those of you who were at the talk yesterday, because I already told you the answer. Yes, that's basically and so in particular, I mean, there's a few steps to, but in particular, they believe that the self is anitya, which means for the Buddhists, they think that the self doesn't actually ultimately exist. If it's anitya, if it's impermanent, it doesn't ultimately exist. They think there is no self. So now, if you don't know Indian philosophy and you know, you can't make those steps, you don't know those basic ideas, and you can't make those steps, if you don't know you know, this thing about Buddhism, then you might have no idea what the problem is. A Hindu says self is conscious to a Buddhist. You might say, okay, that seems like a legitimate, you know, thing to debate. But Haribhadra's commentary explains, you know, that again, that the Buddhists think that there is no self. You strike out the self, and there's Sankhya there. Sankhya is a particular kind. That's the example that he uses, a particular kind of Hindu philosophy. And so Haribhadra tells us Buddhists think there is no self, no Atman, and therefore and this is also, by the way, this is one of the things that he covers in his survey, the Shadarshan Samuchaya, the compendium of the six philosophies, right? He tells us Buddhists think there is no self. And so then that means that the Buddhists don't share the minimal amount of common ground required for a Hindu to prove to them that the self is conscious. If a Hindu wants to, you know, prove to a Buddhist that the self is conscious, the Hindu first needs to prove that there is a self, that there is an Atman, so that you can have this conversation and all before starting to debate what it's like, right? You can't talk about, you know, the nature of classic example in Sanskrit philosophy. You know, you can't talk about the nature of the hair of the horn of a rabbit. You know, if there's no horns on rabbits, right? So, or you can't talk about the nature of the crow's teeth, the teeth of the crow, because crows don't have teeth. There's nothing to talk about. So this is why Haribhadra's very neutral compilation of the doctrines of the six schools, the Shadarshan Samuchaya, you know, this is why this was important, to do this kind of very neutral surveying of what the different schools believe, because you need to know who's at the table, and you need to literally come to terms with them to establish a background of shared terms in order to be able to understand and grapple with your differences. You need to find some common ground in order for debate to get off the ground. And this is, of course, I think, another great lesson for the big public disagreements that we're facing today, where it doesn't seem like there is any common ground, right? People seem to be living in different mental and factual universes altogether and just can't even talk to each other. So people just end up talking past each other, and people end up shutting each other off and you know, cutting each other off and not wanting to have these conversations. Now, of course, you know, what if there is no such common ground? And this is sort of a problem that I feel like, you know, a lot of us feel these days, that we don't even know where to begin. There is no common ground that we can find with people who radically disagree with us. So what do we do when we're facing fundamental, intractable disagreement, when people's really basic commitments seem to be at odds? Like, for example, you know, if one person thinks there's the soul and another thinks there isn't, that's a very basic disagreement, it seems. Well, I argue in my dissertation that I am working to turn into a book now, as Nitinji said. I argue that this is exactly where anekantavad, the theory of non-one-sidedness or theory of multiplicity, comes in. So the central theory, the central idea of anekantavad, as Haribhadra Suri explains it in his great magnum opus, the Anekanta Jayapataka, the victory flag of non-one-sidedness, is how I would translate this title. The basic idea is that any real thing in the world can be described in opposite ways. A little more technically, any real thing admits of contrary predicates. That's how philosophers would say this. So that is, for example, any real thing is both existent and not existent. Contraries, okay? Both permanent and impermanent, and so on like that. So, sorry, I'm just gonna take off my sweater real quick. The heat has come on. Okay. So for example, Hindu philosophers said in this example from the Introduction to Logic, Hindu philosophers said that the Atman soul exists, and Buddhists said that it doesn't. Hindus said that the soul was everlastingly permanent, and Buddhists said that there is no such thing, that everything is impermanent. So now the Anikantavadi comes in and says, what? Says neither of these extreme one-sided views captures the whole truth. It's actually both of them, both existent and non-existent, both permanent and impermanent. Now, how can that be? That might sound a little, so any real thing is X and is not X. How can that be? Sorry. Okay, so Haribhadra says that this is because any real thing, vastu in Sanskrit, exists, it's existent and non-existent, both, right? Because it's existent in the form of its own substance, place, time, and state, and is non-existent in the form of another's substance, place, time, and state. That is, I would simplify, I would put this in a nutshell as saying that anything exists as what it is, it's existent as itself, and is non-existent as something else. Anything is what it is and is not what it isn't. Okay, so that might sound actually now quite obvious and straightforward. And I think that's exactly the point for Haribhadra Suri. He actually says that this is something that everyone knows to be true. It's total common sense. And therefore, it can cut through these disagreements between religions that that you have these what seem to be these very fundamental disagreements between religions. And it gives us something that we can all agree on and develop a philosophical system on. And he, in fact, develops he goes to great lengths to develops a very large systematic metaphysics from this basic idea. And so, likewise, anything he applies this to other situations, other pairs of opposites, other pairs of contrary predicates. Anything is really anything is both. No, that's not there yet. Anything is both existent and non-existent. So that's the one. Anything is also permanent and impermanent. He also says anything is both same and different, universal and particular, and so on. So the permanent and impermanent thing, for example, that's really important, right? Because he says that anything is both permanent and impermanent because it's permanent because it remains, right? It's like, so something like the soul or anything that we're talking about, it remains, but it doesn't just disappear. You don't see things just disappearing, right? Flitting out of existence, but it changes. And so it's impermanent because it changes. So you can't understand something changing without seeing its basic stability, as the Hindu philosophers say, but at the same time, nothing ever stays completely still, just like the Buddhists say. So each of them is getting something right. Each of them is onto something, but neither of them actually really makes sense fully or really works without the other one. You really need them both to really understand what's really going on with reality. So the famous Acharya Siddha Sen Divakar, who preceded Haribhadra Suri and was very influential on Haribhadra Suri, very famously says that all viewpoints, the word here is naya, all viewpoints without exception are false views as bound to their own positions. However, as mutually dependent, they become properly truthful. When viewpoints are mutually dependent, they are truthful when they are taken together. When they're just bound to their own positions, when they're separated from the other ones and just sort of confined to their own positions, they're false. He goes on to say, each viewpoint is truly assertable in its own domain, but wrong when it intrudes upon another. A person who sees this non-one-sidedness of reality, this he doesn't say it in the shloka here, but he's talking about Syadvada, Anekantavada. Person who sees this does not distinguish them as simply true or false. You see a more nuanced, complex picture. So what we have to do is we have to specify the respect in which each view is true, and then you get a full nuanced description of reality in all its aspects. So another great Acharya, Mallavadin Kshamashamana, says that this approach can put an end to debates, actually, because what looked like disagreements turn out, in fact, to be complementary perspectives that are actually compatible with each other. Things that seem to be opposed to each other are actually compatible with each other, and they only conflict if you insist that either of them or any of these apparently, conflicting, opposing perspectives are exclusively true. If you see the way that they complement each other, then you don't have a problem anymore. So sometimes people see Anekantavada as something very sort of complex or mysterious. And, I think it can be a little hard to understand sometimes. Sometimes people, read it as saying that sort of nothing is true. And I think that's really off base, actually. Anekantavada is really all about getting at what is really true. It's about doing full justice to reality. And in fact, as Haribhadra explains it, as I said, it's really a matter of common sense, of just sort of looking at what's right there in front of you, rather than trying to depict reality in some sort of really abstract way that no one actually experiences, saying it's only existent, it's only non-existent, it's only permanent, it's only impermanent. And I think it should be clear how, that we can all benefit from sort of looking at things in this more nuanced, complex, multi-sided way. So that, in a nutshell, is what I argue in my dissertation and forthcoming book in much more detail, and taking up many intricate philosophical issues. That takes me about 100,000 words over there, and so you can read the dissertation online if you want, or you can wait for it to come out. I won't tell you who's going to publish it yet because I don't have the contract in hand yet, but it'll be good. But I should cut it off here because no one wants to hear another 97,000 words. So and I want to hear some from you all, some thoughts. So I'm happy to try to answer any follow-up questions you might have, but I'd also like to hear your own thoughts. I'm particularly interested to know, what do you see as potentially valuable about the study of Jainism in a secular American university? What can we scholars do in our capacity as scholars that Jain communities would appreciate? So so now I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much for your patience and attention, and your support, and Michami Dukkadam. Maybe we should give you a mic, yeah? Mm-hmm.
One of the questions I have is, whenever I'm in a debate, some people will come and say that there's no way that one person can know every single thing.
Yeah.
And so any debate is kind of useless to begin, because nobody knows everything to have a debate. So there's so much out there we don't know. So whatever you're talking about, it's all. So now that becomes, it actually makes you a handicap of sorts. And you're like, okay, I'm giving up on everything because I can't know anything, and you can't know anything. And that's how I justify doing whatever I want to do. Yeah. So how do you handle that? Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. And I think Haribhadra Suri would say that you don't need to know everything. It's interesting, actually, in Anekanta Jayapataka, in his discussion of Anekantavada, in these other, all of the texts that I've shown, actually, he doesn't, although, so obviously omniscience, Kevala Jnana, Sarvatnyatva, is very important in Jainism, right? This is an important characteristic of the Jina, but in fact, Haribhadra Suri does not rely on it at all. In any of these texts I've shown, he doesn't say you have to be omniscient, you have to know everything, and that's how you actually get at the truth. He doesn't depend on that. What he depends on is just this kind of dialectical interaction with these different views. So I think, so what he's showing us, and what he would say is just start where you are. And just by this contact of different views, just by being exposed to a different view
and, different views, and trying to negotiate and figure out and use your human reason to navigate and negotiate these different views, then you can get at some truth. Now it might not necessarily be everything. It might not be the the full and final thing. But he actually often does talk about Paramartha, the ultimate truth, as really just coming out of Vyavahara, the normal everyday interactions, conventional truth of just everyday, things that we see and that we talk about. So I think that's the message is, start where you are, and you will learn, and you can get some truth. You can get some purchase on truth just by being exposed to and trying to navigate and think through different ideas. Yeah.
The problem many times that I face is that they think that human intellect is limited.
Yeah.
And so they don't have a viewpoint. They're like, but you're wrong. They know
Right.
this, that you're wrong. And they know that the one who is debating against us is like, I don't know anything because my intellectual is, and
Right.
it applies to you and everybody else. So any book that you go is just giving his or her viewpoint.
Right.
So
Right.
how do you actually make them, come to the table and have some viewpoints and have a discussion? Or you don't like, okay, not a place like the example you gave between Buddhist and Hindu.
Yeah.
You kind of let it be,
Yeah.
have them do what they want and
Yeah.
leave it at.
Yeah. So great. That's a great follow-up question. Again, so yeah, like a lot of certainly this is a common tack in religions and also beyond religions, where you sort of have an idea of expertise. I think it's important to recognize and defer to experts, but certainly there's this common, tack, and certainly in religion where it's like, okay, look, you have, the scriptural infallible truth that's here. And so you don't know anything. You can't. So this is what it is. I don't even need to listen to your limited, very sort of low grade human knowledge, lo-fi human knowledge. We have scriptural truth here. And again, this is this is not what Haribhadra Sutta is doing at all. He never makes this move. He never says, in fact, he in all these texts that I looked at, although he is the most important scriptural commentator, the most important commentator on the Prakrit Agamas, maybe of all time. He's the first one to really comment on them in Sanskrit. So he knows the Agamas, he knows scripture better than anybody, and yet he never, in these philosophical texts, he never appeals to Agama. Never. And so I think what he's showing is, yeah, because if I want to engage you in debate and you don't believe in my agamas, then why would I start citing my agamas? You're not going to listen to me. And then, yeah, we could just not have the conversation, but then that doesn't get you anywhere. And so, so what he's always doing is, what he's not doing, as you can see, he's not saying, well, okay, there's this disagreement, just throw up our hands, and we don't have the same scriptures, we don't have the same agams, so there's nothing to discuss, and we just have to just not discuss it. You believe what you want to believe, I believe what I want to believe. No, he's having the conversation, he's engaging in the conversation, and he is showing that you can learn and you can get closer to the truth by having the conversation, and and trying to find what it is that this is, it's a very complex and long process and a nuanced process, but basically, the back and forth and seeing what it is in each of the positions that is, that's getting on to something right, and where it is that they're falling short. And so how you can improve the view, basically. Thank you. Good questions.
Anyone else? People from the
Hmm.
do you have any questions for him?
First of all, thank you for excellent talk. I didn't mention that earlier. And one of the points that you said, that willingness to revise your beliefs when new information comes in.
Yeah.
That's so very important. Even in any philosophy, there are so many sub-philosophies now. And
Yeah.
having that thought process even within the philosophy is also so very important. And really appreciate you bringing that up and making that one of your points. Now, one of the questions that I always face in debates is, oh, science, the current science and philosophy does not match. I mean, like, let's say if they're saying Jainism is right, okay, fine. They're talking about certain things. There are certain things which absolutely do not agree with science. And so science is what we know. What is written in the books is wrong.
Right.
And if one thing is wrong, the whole book is wrong, then why do you want to even bother reading, listening, or doing anything about it?
Yeah.
So how do you handle that debate?
So I'm not quite, I mean, it's another very good and very important question. I am not quite sure how Haribhadra Suri would answer it, and I will always want to defer to him first because he's much smarter than I am and try to figure out what he would say. And you know, in these, as I say, in these works that that I'm studying, he doesn't, you know, he doesn't engage with scriptures very much, and so there's not this, and he's not living in a world where you have, you know, an institution of science of this sort of, you know, cumulative empirical progression, you know, this kind of project of revision of sort of empirical theories and so on. So it's a different, it is that in that sense, he's living in a world with a different model of knowledge. I think, and so now here I'm speaking a little bit more on my own behalf because I'm not sure exactly what Haribhadra Suri would say, but I think he might agree with me about this, that one thing that is important in when you're dealing with scripture is to understand the interpretive aspect of scripture. That scripture is never just saying what it's saying once and for all, and it's clear what it's saying, and then you can just assume that, you know, that's sort of that's the final word, because scripture always has to be interpreted. And I think Haribhadra Suri would agree with this because he was, as I've already said, the greatest scriptural interpreter, you know, of his time, and perhaps of all time, you know, in Jainism. I mean, you know, certainly one of the most prolific. So he clearly didn't think that all you needed was Agam, and then Agam just is there and says what it says, and then you just defer to it. He spilled much more ink, in fact, on trying to interpret and explain Agam, scripture, than he did on all his other stuff, on Anikantavada, or, you know, the philosophical stuff or anything. So clearly he thinks that you have to interpret scripture, and that there's a lot that happens in the interpretation, and maybe, you know, any one person's interpretation is not exactly right. And so, you know, if a scripture seems to make a certain claim, maybe you have to reinterpret it. And you're always reinterpreting things. You're always interpreting things in light of your beliefs, in light of other beliefs and things that, you know, other things that you know to be true. And so, you know, I mean, this is of course a big issue about science and religion stuff. And what do you do with the truth claims of religion and the truth claims of science? And I personally think that, you know, you have to, and of course, Haribhadra Suri, as I said, can't answer directly that question because he didn't have science as we understand it. But I think, you know, there are ways. You don't have to just get rid of your scripture because it seems to conflict with science. I think you always can interpret and reinterpret and be willing to interpret things in different ways, to, you know, so that you can develop a unified worldview that sort of takes into account all the information that you have. Best I can do with that. So that's a big and a hard one. Yeah.
So you also mentioned earlier, how do you bring this, what kind of classes should you teach in the university, or how can you bring it to the masses, right? And so I teach the bachelor classes here, and what I've noticed is, this is great, so much, you know, great information. But I think that when I'm trying to explain this to my students, sometimes I lose them But when I sort of stick to like the core, so I think we talk so much. So this kind of information you may be sharing in a religious class, and only certain type of students end up coming to that, and they already come with so much background, to be able to understand this level of material, they already have taken previous classes, right? And they're kind of, but when you talk about just debate, rules of a debate, why should you debate? That is such a common thing, that like a high schooler should understand. So I think that we need to sort of go to the, just as a suggestion, go to the core, which is so important, where it's coming from, who created it, where, where all of this background is really important to know, and it makes it legitimate. But every student may not understand. But if we can introduce these kind of topics in, I remember taking classes like logic, nothing to do with religion. They were like, just as a business school student, you needed to take that. But having, being able to introduce such topics there, I mean, this is so important to be able to debate, right? There are so many people that don't come to the table. They do think that, what is the point of debating? I mean, there's just majority nowadays are like that. And being able to introduce them to why you should do it is so valuable, right? So just a suggestion. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for, I understand that the Pathshala classes are tomorrow or on Sundays. Yeah. So thank you for making the extra trip in today. There was some discussion of, it would be nice to do this tomorrow when there are more people in the building, and then people don't have to make the extra trip. So I appreciate it, but it just wasn't possible. I'm flying back to New Jersey today. So thank you for making the extra trip today, and all of you. But yeah, and I mean, one thing is that it just makes me, what you're saying, makes me think of is that there's sort of, you have this scholarly activity that we do, right? The people like me that are, we are spending our full time. This is our day job, to sort of spend all our time studying these things. And so we're making a lot of distinctions, getting very technical, and going, and these things are really very complicated. I mean, and you just look at, let's say the writings of Haribhadra Suri, massive, voluminous, in Sanskrit, Prakrit, and all the, languages that are difficult to understand, and difficult concepts to understand. And there are all sorts of things, issues, methodological issues. It's very complicated. And so a lot of times, so I mean, I said that any of you can download or read my dissertation online, but you don't really want to. It's really a very, technical and boring read. And that's, it's like, it's, shop talk. It's like, that's what we do. Right. But then I'm doing that not just because I like shop talk and just because I just want to be, an industry man, but because I see there's some bigger purpose to it all, right? There's some bigger meaning that I think these issues are important for life, society, and the world generally. And so it's important for me to try to, maintain that view, that eye on sort of the bigger picture and the essence and the importance of all of this stuff. And it can be hard, and then it can be hard to come back when you're, in making all the fine technical distinctions, to then boil it down to the essence. I find it very challenging. But I think it's important to do. And that's why, me doing things like this, where I'm talking to people who are not my, two closest colleagues that, or my dissertation advisors, people who can understand all of the little technicalities, but just trying to make it accessible in a way that anyone, can understand. That's really important, I think. And so I'm always trying to figure out how to do that. I welcome also, I appreciate hearing back from you and, hearing the ways that, that you understand it and what you take away from it and the questions you have. And because I'm always, I'm always trying to do better at sort of translating this into, understandable language. Yeah. News you can use, as they say. Yeah, please.
So a comment. I just want to, first of all, thank the Jain community, the Houston community, and the North American Jain community for helping fund scholars like you.
Yes.
I mean, this has happened in the past 10, 15 years, and this type of research would never have happened without, the realization that we need to fund academia and Jain academia.
Yeah.
And so thank you to the Jain community in
Yes.
Houston for, supporting this program through Rice University. We're going to have an annual lecture series now on Jainism and all the new professorships that are opening up across the country. Hopefully you'll be a professor at a renowned institution one day teaching Jainism. So, this is the fruits of the labor that everyone has been helping to accomplish.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I just can only echo my humblest thanks and gratitude. I mean, as I said, sorry, in the beginning of my talk, I am just so appreciative to be able to make this my full-time career, to do what I do, and be able to make a lifestyle vocation out of it. It's only possible because, the generosity of others. Yeah.
So I come from a Christian background. And so I find it curious and very enlightening how this is a religious practice, this debate, learning debate, the practice and skill. And so one thing just personally that I've always had an issue with is that in American culture, we are always told you don't talk about religion and politics.
Yes.
So how does this translate, or where does it find life and traction in American society?
Yeah. Yeah, it is a great question. I mean, one thing I'll say is, like, I wish I knew better, because I really, I don't think I'm a particularly great debater. When I encounter someone, I'm embarrassed now to admit this because I've been talking about debate, but I don't think I'm particularly great at practicing what I'm preaching. When I come to someone who has really fundamental disagreements, I have this instinct, this very American instinct, let's just not talk about it. Let's just get along and not, I think, and I think there are, one thing I will say about this is that I think, part of the issue here is that the model of American secularism is a privatization of religion. So it's that you have the separation of church and state thing. Religion is not supposed to enter into the public sphere. And that's how we have our liberal, democratic, tolerant discourse that this is supposed to be where you basically bracket your religious commitments in order to have some sort of social peace kind of thing, and that that is not the model that Haribhadra Suri is presenting. That's also interesting, is not quite the model of Indian secularism. I mean, in Indian secular, you have the modern Indian nation is in its constitution is a secular one. It's supposed to be a secular nation, but not one that quite privatizes religion or that sort of relegates religion, only to the private sphere. Not exactly. It's much more complicated, and it's more one about sort of fairness towards religions rather than so fairness towards all religions rather than sort of pushing religions and religious discourse in the closet. And I think there's a way in which you can see in Indian society, therefore, sort of, religion and religious discourse a little bit more publicly. So how can we bring this into American society? I mean, so there are some political theorists and religious ethicists who have been talking about how we need to move toward basically a model where the arguments that you offer in public, that you don't exclude religious arguments from being offered in public. You don't exclude people's religious belief from public discourse. You don't continue to say that, okay, you're making an argument for such and such thing on the basis of your religious belief, and therefore that argument is not publicly allowed in a secular space. We don't need to listen to it. Rather, that people can bring people should be upfront about sort of the religious basis of their belief, but also be attentive to their audiences. And again, trying to find common ground on sort of a kind of a case-by-case basis. So thinking about how your religious convictions can also speak to the person that that you're speaking to, even if they are not of the same religion, but you might still be able to find some common ground with them that resonate with both of your religious convictions. And you might have to do that differently for different audiences. Of course, what that means when you're sort of in this in this sort of hyper, social media sphere where anyone could be reading anything at any time. It's hard to know who your audience is and who you're talking to, and it's complicated. But that is sort of a basic idea that has that some people have been pushing for, sort of getting past this idea that you sort of get rid of religious reasons and religious ideas in public, and rather be more upfront about them and more actively trying to think about how they land with others and how they can speak to others. And that, as I said, I mean, that is actually very much what this sort of system of debate that I was talking about argues for. That you got to think about who you're speaking to, and be sensitive to their own convictions and how your convictions might or might not speak to theirs. And then also, I think learning back from them also, and being able to take their ideas into account into your own ideas. Some suggestions there, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I would like to sincerely thank Dr. Mundra for coming here today. I wanted to just think about one great thing that's happening with the academia being involved in the study of Jainism, is that you are putting Jainism in a much modern context, in a language that is more intelligible, because this is the language from 2000 years ago, and it has different cultural and social contexts and philosophical contexts than the ones that we live in today's world. So the efforts of people, professors and academics like Dr. Mundra are immensely important in today's world. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Namaskar. We appreciate it. Thank you. A big hand for him. And we hope that you will visit us in future once you have your dissertation ready and published.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you again.
Thank
And
you very
thank you
much.
all for visiting. A few,
Yeah,
but
thank you.
very good listeners. So
Yeah,
appreciate
yeah.
that. And as we-
Small but great audience. Thank you.
And it was a beautiful coincidence that while he is talking about the multiplicity of viewpoints, Anikant, right? We have people from interfaith ministries, so it's a beautiful coincidence. And I think that interfaith ministries is playing a very beautiful part in bringing people of different faiths together. And this philosophy of Haribhadra, I mean, you can apply it to anything and everything in life, because we are so polarized and it's creating so much chaos in our societies. So I would like to invite you to say a few words to everyone here, if you would like to, please.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words on behalf of Interfaith Ministries. As you all know, our shared experience of COVID has definitely isolated all of us. And it is such a joy to be able to spend this time as an agency and personally to reinvent and resurrect what it means to be interfaith in Houston. One of the things that we're doing, and one of the reasons I'm here, and my colleague Jenny and Jeff, is that we are really emphasizing interfaith house of worship tours. So tomorrow, we're going to be taking a group of people from Temple Sinai, and we're going to be taking them to the Baps Swami Mandir, and then to the Brand Lane Masjid. Next week, we'll be taking more to the Vietnam Temple and to the Hare Krishna Temple. And so once you are in a place of worship and you are singing and dancing and smelling the incense of another person's culture, that complete just immersion in another person's experience of the divine, it just opens up a whole new opportunity of understanding. I like to tell people, let me show you the world, and we won't even leave Houston. And this community, this is the first time I've been to the Jain temple. We've been to the meditation center, and it is just amazing to get to see this house of worship. And you are now in our mind and in our understanding, so that we can bring other groups here who have never even heard of Jain. And just every little bit increases your knowledge. And as on behalf of Interfaith Ministries, that's why we're here, is to facilitate this across traditions, across cultures, across our city. And so please, I invite any of you to contact us. And I would love to take the Jain community on a tour of, would you like to go to Easter morning services in a Christian tradition? Maybe you've never seen that, or to go to a Shabbat service at a Jewish synagogue. You know, these are the experiences that help us grow, and I think are the living embodiment of the lecture that we just heard, right? To be able to experience something different than what you're used to and finding commonality in that. So that's why we're here. And I just thank you for welcoming us this morning. And it is a beautiful coincidence that we were able to hear this. It is just really an echo of what we do and who we are. So, and obviously of what you believe. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Pam. We appreciate it. We are now wrapping up our program for today, but we have some refreshments outside and tea, I believe. So
thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Anil, coming to our center, Jain Society of Houston, and thank you, Interfaith Ministry, coming to our center. It's a great coincidence that you met together in the same place, and we had an opportunity you be here. We have a refreshment, snacks, and the tea outside. So if anybody wants to take the chance to have that, have it. Thank you.